Hey everybody, this is Andrew Brokos. You may know me as Foucault, which was my screen name on PokerStars and on 2plus2, or as the blogger behind Thinking Poker, or the podcaster behind the Thinking Poker podcast. I'm real excited to be on the Tournament Poker Edge team now, to be making videos for Tournament Poker Edge, making videos for you all. And my first video series is going to be about hand reading, which of course is a very central skill to poker. And I think it's a really underappreciated skill in tournaments. I think a lot of people spend too much time, well, not too much time. I mean, it's important to think about your own hand, but a lot of people focus on the cards that they have in a tournament and on what they're hoping will happen, which, are you trying to make your opponent fold? Are you trying to make your opponent call? And not so much on what kinds of hands their opponents have. A lot of people, I think their actions are too driven by their own cards. So I think this is going to be a really helpful series for you. And I think that I have a pretty good method for making hand reading easy. I can't promise that this is going to let you get 100% of the benefits of hand reading, but hand reading is a really hard thing to do. It's something that you're going to get better at with practice, but it's not something that you have to do perfectly to get a lot out of it. So what I'm going to show you is a pretty easy method for narrowing down your opponent's range and figuring out certain types of hands that he might have, rather than trying to put your opponent on exactly um, 7-6 for an open-ended straight jaw, or exactly top pair with a medium kicker. All you're going to try to do is determine the relative strength of your opponent's hand. Exactly how strong is it, how much showdown value does it have, and that alone probably enables you to accomplish something like 70 or 80% of the benefits of hand reading. And it's a lot easier than the full-on range analysis. So this, I think, is a real good way to get started on hand reading, to get a lot of the benefit out of it, to improve your play quickly. And then as you start using this process, I think if you are thinking actively about it and working on it, then more hand reading is going to come to you as you go along. The central idea here, and the things that we're going to focus on specifically in this video, because this is going to be a series. In this first video, we're going to work on learning to categorize your opponent's hand as being either a monster hand, a marginal hand, or a hand that has very little showdown value, meaning either he has absolutely nothing or he has some sort of draw. We'll talk a lot more about what those categories mean, but you're going to learn to think in terms of these three categories. You're going to learn to think logically about your opponent's ranges, and specifically to identify which of these categories of hands might or might not be in your opponent's range. It's ideal if you can narrow it down and say he definitely has a monster hand. It's the only thing he could possibly play that way. That, I think, has pretty obvious advantages in terms of your decision making. But even just excluding a single type of hand from your opponent's range can make a big difference. If you're able to say my opponent couldn't possibly have a hand with no showdown value here based on the way that he's played. I don't know if he has a monster hand or just a marginal hand, but he couldn't possibly have a hand with no showdown value. That alone is enough to enable you to fold all of your bluff catchers when he bets. If the only thing you can beat is a bluff and you're sure your opponent doesn't have a hand that needs to bluff, then you can fold. So that's just one example. And in future videos, we're going to talk a lot more about how to use this information. But these first two videos are just going to focus on learning to do this hand reading technique. The second video in this series we're going to go through some examples and practice using this. But first, I want you to understand what are the categories that we're using, how are we going to try to use them, and then the last thing we're going to talk about in this video is how to make your hand reading more specific to your opponents through specific things that you might notice a certain player doing and notes that you would take on a player. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to learn a hand reading process that's based on a certain set of assumptions, and then as you play, you're going to look for reasons to think that those assumptions may not apply to your opponent, that maybe he plays hands a little bit differently than I'm going to tell you should assume people often will be playing their hands. So a little bit more about these three categories. Monster hands are these extremely good hands. Often your opponent will be trying to get his entire stack into the pot, or if not his entire stack, it's a hand that your opponent will often be trying to bet 3 streets for value, or maybe even get a raise at some point. These are really strong hands with which most players are going to want to try to build big pots. Depending on how deep you are, it may not be a pot worth his entire stack, but it's a hand that he thinks is extremely strong. He thinks it's extremely likely he has the best hand. There's a lot of second best hands that can pay him off, and he's tried to build a pot. That's what we have in mind when we talk about monster hands. Marginal hands are hands that are not trying to play a big pot. They're hands that have a good chance of being best, but are not can't expect to get a lot of action from worse hands. So these are hands usually that your opponent is going to be trying to show down cheaply. Depending on how many draws are on the board, he may be betting them for protection, but they're not hands where a lot of value betting takes place. Like maybe one or two small value bets depending on how good the player is and depending on the action. But mostly these are hands that your opponent is going to be trying to keep the pot small and get the hand to showdown rather than play a big pot. And then this is really the most common type usually, unless your opponent starts with a really strong pre-flop range, are hands that have very little chance of winning unimproved. So you can call these draws, you can call them air. The significant thing about them is that they don't have a lot of showdown value, which means that in order to win, they have to either improve or bluff you out of the pot. Many of these hands will end up folding at some point over the course of a hand. What you can expect, especially from better players, although I think this is becoming more and more common, is that people will play these sorts of hands aggressively if you give them the opportunity to. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We'll come back to that point. But these are the three categories. The monster hands, marginal hands, and air or draw hands. And we're going to learn ways of identifying which of these hands may or may not be in your opponent's range. When it comes to monster hands, we're trying to determine whether or not your opponent might have a monster hand. Well, the best indication of hand strength is how much money your opponent is willing to put into the pot. So the more that he's betting and raising, the more there's an indication that he really likes his hand. Anytime he's willing to put a large percent of his stack into the pot, even if he's not the aggressor, that's one indication that he may have a monster hand. When I talk about suspicious checks and unexpected aggression, I guess these are the sorts of things that put up a red flag to you. So for unexpected aggression, we're talking about your opponent checks the flop, checks the turn, then all of a sudden makes some big bet on the river or raises a bet that you make on the river. Just something that's kind of out of sorts with what he's represented throughout the hand. He sort of all of a sudden wakes up and gets very aggressive, or checks in a spot where you'd expect him to bet very often. These can be indications of a monster hand. Anytime that he's putting large amounts of passive money into the pot, meaning that he's calling rather than betting or raising, you're all probably familiar with what David Sklansky calls the gap concept, the idea that particularly in a tournament where winning the pot has additional importance, and the larger the pot gets, the more you want to give yourself the chance to win it without showdown rather than going to showdown. Raising is not necessarily a sign of strength. You see the amount of pre-flop aggression that goes on in tournaments these days. Calling can often be a greater sign of strength than raising, because when you call, it means that you have no chance of winning the pot without showdown. So when you call, especially a large bet, it's usually an indication either that you're a pretty loose player or that you have a hand that's so strong that you feel like you can forego the chance of fold equity. You can forego any value there is to be had by raising and causing your opponent to fold, and you're willing to put a lot of money in the pot passively. That means that you're putting a lot of stock in the showdown value of your hand. Since you're giving up any kind of fold equity, you must put a lot of stock in your showdown equity, or just a loose player. But from a good player who's willing to put a lot of passive money into the pot, that can be an indication that he has a monster hand. Anytime a player is willing to put money into a multi-way pot, the more players there are in the pot, the more likely it is that anyone who's putting money in likes his hand. It takes a better hand to win in a multi-way pot. Most people understand that. So if they're willing to put money in when there's a lot of people involved, it's an indication that they think their hand is pretty good. And then just to kind of drive home this point about how much money you're willing to put into the pot, when you're risking the last of your chips, when you're overbetting the amount of the pot, when you're making suspiciously large bets, these again, indications of a monster hand. To be clear, none of these mean that your opponent definitely has a monster hand. The more of them that you see, the more comfortable you can be thinking that he really likes his hand, but there are other types of hands that might play this way as well. But these are all things that would cause you to think that monsters may be a category that is in your opponent's range. Looking for marginal hands. If when your opponent is calling and checking, especially in spots that, so you see we have on here like passing up good bluffing opportunities, especially if your opponent is calling and checking in spots that strike you as good bluffing opportunities. A real obvious example of this is when someone passes up what seems to you a very standard continuation betting spot. He raises pre-flop, you call, and the flop comes out in a way that you think is very good for a continuation bet. You check fully expecting that he's going to make a continuation bet, and he doesn't make one. I think that's often an indication of a marginal hand. It was a spot where if your opponent had a hand that needed to bluff, he probably would have made that bluff. The fact that he chose not to bluff is an indication that he didn't need to. It's an indication that he thinks that he has some showdown value, but at the same time, he's not trying to build the pot, which might be what we'd expect him to do if he had a monster hand. So checking, particularly in spots where a bet very well may cause you to fold relatively often, checking or calling, making these more passive options that bring the pot closer to showdown without building the pot tend to be an indication of marginal hands. And here we're talking about calling and checking in less suspicious spots. I know we talked about calling and checking possibly being identifiers of monster hands, and in those cases it was more suspicious calls or suspicious checks, calls that represented a large percentage of your stack. In circumstances where it seems like your opponent is just trying to keep the pot small and get to showdown, that's a pretty strong indicator that he's got a marginal hand. Likewise, small bets and blocking bets, like you don't see blocking bets as much before the river, but the smaller the bet, the more it indicates that your opponent is not as confident in the strength of his hand. You'll see some people, this I think is a little more true in live poker than in online poker. You'll see people where the size of their bet correlates pretty well to the strength of their hand. So when their hand is big, especially on later streets, they'll make larger bets, and when their hand is small, they'll make smaller bets. And that's just a clear indication that they think they have the best hand. Maybe they want to charge a little something if there's draws out there, or they want to avoid what they would interpret as a show of weakness of checking. So, but they want to avoid playing a big pot, and so they just make small bets. In terms of identifying draws or air, when the board is very draw heavy, but your opponent is not indicating any desire to protect a hand, not betting, not raising, that's an indication that he doesn't have a hand worth protecting. It seems more like he's interested in seeing the next card, which usually draws are the sort of hand that want to see the next card. And if you have a made hand on a board where a lot of draws are possible, usually those kinds of hands don't want to see the next card, or the next card is more likely to hurt those hands or be scary for those hands than if a player has a draw. So if a player is playing in a way that indicates he is not concerned about all the draws on the board and in fact is interested in seeing the next card, which is what checking or calling on this sort of board indicates, that may indicate that he has either a draw or that he just has air and he's giving up on it. He's declining to bluff, but obviously he doesn't have anything to protect. He has no showdown value, and therefore is not concerned about protection. He's just either giving up or hoping to catch some miracle card on the next street. Calling when a raise is likely to be called, checking when a bet is likely to be called. This is like the opposite of what we talked about for the showdown hands. We said that if your opponent is checking when a bet is likely to result in a fold, that's an indication that he has showdown value. So just the opposite is true in a spot where you think it's pretty obvious that you're going to be willing to call a bet, like maybe you called a big bet on the flop, and then your opponent chooses to check the turn when it's not a particularly scary card or anything. If it seems very likely that you're going to call again and your opponent doesn't bet, well, that's a good indication that he doesn't want to build the pot. Maybe because he has a draw or air. It could also mean that he has a showdown bound hand that he doesn't feel so good about anymore, which means it's starting to creep into the air category. This is an indication of how much showdown value your opponent believes his hand to have. And if he's choosing not to build the pot in a spot where he very easily could, then you've made it clear that you like your hand, and your opponent is choosing not to build the pot when he had the opportunity to do so. That means that he doesn't want to play a big pot, that he'd rather put as little money into the pot as possible, which indicates a weak hand. Often when if your opponent is playing aggressively, but it's in a way that you think he's only representing a thin value range. So people talk about this in terms of a range being polarized or a nuts versus air sort of situation. There's 4 straight cards on the board and your opponent makes a big bet, or the board is 5, 6, 7, 8, or even 5 straight cards for that matter, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, your opponent makes a big bet. A lot of people there, they can either beat the board or they can't. That's especially true on the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 board. Pretty much every hand is going to be either just playing the board or it's going to be a higher straight. That's all that's possible, and I guess unless a flush is possible on the board. But those sorts of bets, and any kind of bet that you wouldn't expect your opponent to make with a showdown hand. If he had the chance just to check behind and see if his hand was good, and he chooses to make a big bet instead, well, that's going to be an indicator either of a monster hand or of a hand that's bluffing. On the river, it would have to be an air hand. On an earlier street, it might be able to represent a draw as well. But if it's a spot where you think your opponent, the only hands he could play for value would be extremely strong hands, well, extremely strong hands are easy to come by. Extremely strong hands are hard to come by. Extremely weak hands are easy to come by. So combinatorically, it's much easier to have an extremely weak hand. If you think your opponent can only have one of the two, there are some players who just don't bluff or won't bluff in certain spots, in which case, okay, they'd have to have the strong hand. But a player who's capable of bluffing, if he has a lot of air in his range for getting to a certain street, and then he makes a bet that you believe can represent only one of a few very strong hands, then there's certainly a chance that he's bluffing in that spot as well. Or you can't eliminate hands with very little showdown value from his range based on the fact that he's made this big bet, whereas you probably could eliminate the medium strength hands from his range. Those are the sorts of hands where he wouldn't feel the need to bluff, and he would probably check behind and try to get closer to showdown. So a large bet on a scare card is an example of that. And I say specifically overbet shoving before the river because I don't think you see a lot of overbet shoving on the river as a bluff. I think a river overbet is a lot more likely to be a value hand. But before the river, it's very common to see people play draws this way, where if they just ship it all in for 3 times the pot on the flop, there's a lot of people who will only ever have big draws in their range when they do that. They're not going to play a set that way. They're certainly not going to play top pair with a bad kicker or medium or second pair that way. The only hand they're going to play that way is some sort of big draw because they think that this is a way to maximize their fold equity. So that can be a clear indicator that your opponent is on a draw. We've made a number of assumptions throughout the identification, those last couple of identification slides where I was talking about how your opponent is likely to play different types of hands. It's possible that while I was talking about those things, you were thinking to yourself, that doesn't sound right to me. I don't think that's how my opponents play, or that's not how I play. Okay, then those are suggestions. They probably are a little bit geared towards better players. That stuff may apply, that particular set of assumptions may apply a little bit less in very small stakes games where people are a bit more loose, a bit more passive. This note-taking method will still work in your game. The only time this wouldn't work is if you're dealing with people who literally don't know the strength of their hand. They don't know how to recognize for themselves that they have a monster hand or what to do about that. I mean, if you're playing with people who are really that clueless, then this method is not going to work. Otherwise, I mean, some of the specific things that I suggested about what a certain play indicates may not be true in your game. It may not be true for a default player in the game that you play, in which case you'll have to decide for yourself which of those are and whether or not they apply to your game if they sound right to you. I think I'm generally pretty comfortable treating those as baseline assumptions. And what I mean by baseline assumptions is if I don't know anything else about a player, then that's the framework that I'm going to use to read his hand. But I know that there are a lot of exceptions to this. There are bad players who play differently, and then there are good players who play somewhat differently than that with the specific purpose of confounding the hand reading process, making it harder to read their hands. There are people who will deliberately play their hands in tricky ways. So when I'm taking notes and when I'm observing my opponents and looking for noteworthy things about them that I want to remember for later in this session and for future sessions, the main thing that I'm looking for is some kind of deviation from these assumptions, some reason to think that the way that I ordinarily read hands is not going to work against this particular player, or that I'm going to have to interpret a certain action that that player takes in a different way than I would a generic player, an unknown player. A couple of examples of this: thin value betting is a real good one, because thin value betting, we said generally with marginal hands that aren't real strong, people are more interested in going to showdown than they are in trying to build a pot. And thin value betting directly contradicts that. So I like to look, and this is something you can do whether or not you're involved in the hand, just see, on the river, what kind of hands does your opponent bet for value. And when you see a player make a thin value bet, you want to make a note of that, because that's going to affect how you read his hand. You can't necessarily just say, oh, well, he made a big bet on the river, he must have either a nutted hand or air. The better a player is, the more he's capable of depolarizing his range, of kind of ironing out that middle category. And with some of his better marginal hands, he can learn to play them sort of like a monster hand, and that makes it harder to read his hand. And then also with some of his worst marginal hands, the hands that have just a little bit of showdown value but not a lot, better players are capable of turning those hands into a bluff. So what you'll see from less skilled players and from more passive players is that they really like to go to showdown when they can. This again is something that's even more true in live poker, although I think there's plenty of it in online poker as well. People are going to bluff when they have nothing, or that's the only time that they'll consider bluffing, is when they have nothing. If they have a hand, even if it's not a very strong made hand, but if they have a hand where they think there's some chance that they're going to win at showdown, most people are going to be happy taking the showdown if they have the opportunity to do that. I think only better players tend to turn hands that have appreciable showdown value into bluffs. And that's another thing that can make a hand really hard to read, because you don't want to end up calling with a really weak bluff catcher against someone like that and find out, oh, he thought he was bluffing, but it ended up being a value bet because you called with something even weaker. So that's something else that can make a guy's hand pretty difficult to read. When we talked about identifying air or drawing hands, I said that if your opponent passes up a good bluffing opportunity, or he checks in a spot where he can expect to have a lot of fold equity, better players know how to identify those spots, and you've got to determine if your opponent misses those. So again, watching how he plays, even if you're not in the hand, watching how he plays hands against other players is going to give you an indication. If you see him pass up really good bluffing opportunities, either obvious continuation betting spots or spots that you think would be good double barreling spots or good river bluffing spots, anytime you see your opponent miss something like that, it's good to make a note of it, because you don't want to end up being in a hand with that person later and saying to yourself, oh, he didn't continuation bet the flop, that must mean that he has some showdown value, when in fact it just means that he's not very good at continuation betting. Your HUD can help you with that as well. The higher a player's continuation bet frequency is, the more you can assume that his check means something, whereas a player with a very low continuation bet frequency, you can't necessarily read a lot into the fact that he didn't continuation bet a certain flop. But if a guy continuation bets 80% of the time and he doesn't continuation bet this time, and you think it's a pretty good spot for a continuation bet, well, the odds that that guy just missed it because he doesn't know how to continuation bet are pretty slim. More likely he had a reason for checking behind, and you want to try to deduce what that reason is. Basically the same thing with slow playing. There are some weaker players who are really in love with the idea of slow playing, and they'll slow play even in pretty bad spots. What I mean by bad spots are what we mentioned before, like when there's a lot of draws on the board, you'll often see people playing aggressively if they think that they have the best hand because they're concerned about protecting against those draws. So if your opponent isn't doing that, if he's very passive, it may just mean that, or if he loves to slow play, that would confound our hand reading process a little bit. We wouldn't be able to assume that he doesn't have a strong hand just because he checked a 5, 6, 7 2 diamond flop. It may mean that he's just really in love with slow playing, and maybe he did check a set there, even though you would never do that. And bet sizing tells. This a little bit more generic, but anytime, I mentioned before, often players will correlate the size of their hand with the size of their bet, or you might see that people only make big bets with strong hands. Somewhat less commonly, you might see that people only make big bets with bluffs, but any kind of indication that you can get from the size of your opponent's bet, or I guess we could probably add timing tells here as well. This kind of thing, it doesn't necessarily have to well, none of this has to be definitive, where obviously poker is a game of incomplete information. So none of this is something that you're going to say, well, 100% it means X. It's just a matter of being, if you observe a number of things that say, my opponent seems to have a marginal hand. The more of those that you observe, the more comfortable you are putting marginal hands into his range. And if you see him doing a bunch of things that you would never expect him to do with a monster hand, then the more comfortable you are saying he probably doesn't have a monster hand in this case. And my hope is that by working on this method a little bit, and as I mentioned, in the next video, we're going to have some examples. The next video, the whole video is going to be dedicated to examples of using this method. So you'll get a better idea of what I mean about how to read hands in this way. Even just being able to identify one of these to eliminate one of these categories from your opponent's range is going to do you a lot of good. I think a lot of people get overwhelmed by hand reading. They just sort of say, well, there's all these possibilities, and maybe by the time you get to the river, you can, if you have a big river decision, you can like go back and try to reconstruct, and it feels a little more manageable in the river because you have so much information. But I feel like a lot of people don't even bother trying to read hands very much pre-flop or on the flop. And that's unfortunate because there is a lot of information out there to be had. I think the reason people are doing this is because they're overwhelmed by how much is possible by the vast number of starting hands. And if there's a guy who's opening 40% of hands pre-flop, from the cutoff or from the button, there's so much different stuff he could have. How are you supposed to read his hand? How are you supposed to put him on a hand when his range is so wide? And the answer is that you don't have to. As I've tried to emphasize here, just being able to see what types of hands he might or might not have is going to do a lot to improve your decision making. And that's something that I hope will become more clear in light of future videos in this series.